Hello, my darlings. Welcome to this episode of The Roman World, in which we pause in our depressing narrative of devolution from republic to empire to grapple with a poem that's all about processing the immediate past through the distant past. That is Virgil's Aeneid, which also happens to be one of my favorite poems ever written, so you'll have to indulge me in a little bit of fangirlishness here. Virgil's Aeneid is an exploration of and meditation on the toll that power takes on the people who wield it, even as it is meditation on, hi little man, the cost that we pay for patriotism. Without any further ado, then let's get into it. I've sworn to myself that this one won't be as massive as the other ones. Let's see if it works. Before we get into the Aeneid, though, we need to look at Augustus a little bit more. We just met him in the last lecture as he was wrapping up the end of the crisis of the late Republic. He went to civil war against Antonius and Cleopatra VII, defeated them both. Antonius takes his own life, and shortly afterwards Cleopatra does as well. After this, Augustus celebrates a triumph in Rome. A lot of people thought that was a bit tacky because you're not supposed to celebrate a triumph against fellow Romans. Augustus got around this by saying, oh no, this isn't about Antonius. This is a triumph over Cleopatra. And some people were not having it, but for a lot of folks, they were afraid. There'd just been another political purge within the past 10 years when the relatives of Caesar had ganged up against Caesar's assassins. And folks remembered that, and they were really worried Augustus was gonna do it again. So, at sword point, mind you, Augustus, well, at this point he was still Octavian, had his troops inside the city of Rome, effectively holding the Senate hostage. So the Senate, in order to save themselves, those senators who were left, voted to award Augustus all kinds of honors. They thanked him for saving the state from Antonius, and they awarded him this title, Augustus, a revered one, honored one. He also takes this title very carefully because he learned from Julius Caesar two things. First, if you forgive too many of your enemies, you're going to end up stabbed to death. And if you call yourself dictator for life, that's too much. It sounds a lot like king. And he's very careful that he's a princeps, he's a first citizen. He's not a rex, he's not a king. And he takes a lot of care to frame what he does as an unprecedented act of restoration, these emergency powers that he just needs for a little while, just to get the Republic back onto a stable footing. And then he makes a big show of stepping back. If you remember from the last lecture, this is when he sets down all of his powers, except for one, the power of the tribune, thus keeping himself sacrosanct, and he also keeps extra tribune powers in the provinces, so he maintains his right to oversee defense of the state. He keeps this commander-in-chief function. But inside the city of Rome, he's very careful to be like, I'm a first citizen, I'm just influential, but I'm not any more powerful than anybody else. It's just that I have good ideas and people listen to me. Of course, they're listening to him because he just killed a lot of Romans who weren't willing to listen to him, and also people are tired. So they're willing to go along with this. They're like, okay, fine. So Augustus is Augustus. We're just going to tolerate the weirdness until he dies. He doesn't die for a really long time. And that brings us to this piece of art we're going to look at. This I've used as a companion piece to another reading that I'm asking you to look at. This is going to be an essay question in Quiz 3. And it is the Res Gestae, which is an inscription. So unlike a lot of the other texts we're looking at, this isn't something that's been copied and recopied and recopied. I mean, it has. But we also have originals because Augustus ordered it to be carved onto stone. and then sent in copies all around the empire. And this was an act of propaganda. This is Augustus controlling the narrative about who he is, why he's totally not a king, and why he deserves your loyalty and your cooperation and collaboration. And it's in that spirit that I'm asking you to read the Res Gestae. I'm asking you to think of yourself as an ancient Roman who's lost family in the last civil war on the other side of the conflict. So imagine that your brother marched with Antonius, or that your cousin was with Antonius and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. Now think if your family didn't take sides, but they got kicked off of their land because Augustus's soldiers needed farmland, which is what Augustus does, is he does some clearance of the countryside in areas that were known to support Antonius and before Antonius Pompey, and he put his own men on it, a lot like Sulla. But because he's the last man standing effectively, and because people are afraid, and they're tired, so he creates this narrative, sends it out, and then you, as the descendants of the other side of this conflict, would be reading this defense. Effectively, what Res Gestae is Augustus gaslighting the entire Roman Empire. And I have to say this in that kind of strong language. If you're not familiar with gaslighting, that's an abuse tactic wherein you, with conviction, lie to somebody about reality that they can see isn't real with their own eyes, and then you try to convince them that your narrative isn't the problem, that their perception is the problem, and that they can't believe their own perception. So part of what makes gaslighting so incredibly destructive and so incredibly useful as a political tactic is that it gets people into the habit of ignoring the evidence of their eyes, their memory. It encourages them to forget about the disturbing things they saw, and it uses the powerlessness of your audience against them. Effectively, the people that you're gaslighting don't have a lot of power to contest your narrative anyway, and if they try, you can use even more violence against them to silence them, as indeed Augustus can. So what ends up happening is that the victim of gaslighting goes with the narrative out of self-preservation and effectively destroys their own sense of self to try to make peace with this lie that they're being forced to live. You probably know someone to whom this has happened. It's really awful, but it's really common because it's effective, and it's something we see modeled by a lot of the people in power. And I'm not just talking about today, right now, but over time. I think every generation has some form of gaslighting or other, encouraging them to not notice stuff that they can't do anything about, or that they think they can't do anything about. I understand why people would give into it too. It's dangerous to question a gaslighter, but it's important that we learn how to do it, and a great way to do that is to confront a gaslighter who is dead and cannot kill you or your family anymore. And Augustus is super dead, y'all. But he's also one of the most successful gaslighters in history, because he's still got a massive fandom, and people who think that he was incredible, that what he did was totally justified. And one of the reasons why it's easy to believe that is that the source material is controlled by Augustus. We have Augustus's Res Gestae. We don't have Antonius's side of the story at all. We don't have Cleopatra VII's very much either. Now I'm saying all of this because I think it will help you to get what I want you to get out of the Res Gestae, which can be a very uninspiring text otherwise, because it seems like a factual recital of all the awesome stuff Augustus ever did. And without a lot of evidence to question the facts Augustus is feeding you, it's hard to see that he's lying or at least manipulating reality a little bit. So here I'm going to give you some things to look for, some items to question when you see them coming up in the Res Gestae. And as I mentioned, we're going to do this through the lens of this portrait too. This is the Primaporta Augustus. This isn't the original. A lot of copies were made and distributed. This isn't the only the only portrait of Augustus that was being used during his reign, but it was a really influential one because it was inside his wife's house, Livia. When Augustus was alive, remember, Livia was doing all of his domestic business while he was out of town. She had a copy of his seal, so if you wanted a meeting with Augustus and he wasn't there, you'd have to meet with Livia. But he'd still be present in the form of this statue. Now, the statue would have been painted back in the day, so we're not getting everything in the statue, but you can kind of get the basic idea. And it's also interesting because it's a military portrait. Most portrait statues of Augustus show him in a toga. Often it's over his head. He's praying, he's sacrificing. He was really big into displaying himself as a very pious man, pious in the Roman sense, right? Devoted to his family, devoted to the gods, devoted to his country, not in that order. And he made a big deal out of his commitment to ongoing peace. Peace, by the way, isn't a warm, fuzzy word for Romans. Let me remind you of an earlier lecture where we talked about peace is related to a Latin verb, pacificare, or pacify. You don't pacify somebody by signing a treaty with them, or negotiating kindly, or inviting them out to dinner. You pacify somebody by marching an army into their land, territory, and or army, and slaughtering them until they surrender, and then you enslave everybody who's alive, and then slowly process them into the next generation of Romans. That's what peace means to Romans. Peace does not mean hug it out to Romans. And it's important to say that because peace is one of these concepts that we've majorly redefined in 2,000 years. Much for the better, quite frankly. I'm really on board with modern definitions of peace. But I think that modern occurrences of peace sometimes hew a lot more to this Roman classic concept. We do normalize violence if it ends in a peace situation that works in our favor. And I'm not saying this to be judgy. I just think this is part of the landscape we live with, and it's important to call what it is, yeah? And as I said, it's unusual that Augustus is in armor here, but part of why the armor is that this is being shown in a context where Augustus's commander-in-chief power is more relevant than it is elsewhere. If Augustus himself is there, you don't need this image. But if you're doing business because Augustus is out of town, the assumption is he's out of town wearing his armor, defending the realm. So part of what Livia's doing when she's using this image of her spouse is she's saying, my spouse is out serving his country, supporting the troops, dressed like a general, out doing the work of maintaining the peace. The work of maintaining the peace involves wearing armor and hitting people with swords. It also is a tacit threat because the times when Augustus wore armor were times of civil war. However much Augustus would like you to believe that his victory was over, just Cleopatra and Antonius was there, kind of, and he didn't count by then because he was not really Roman anymore. That's some very specious gaslighting right there. Antonius was totally a Roman. His job was governing the Eastern Mediterranean. So, yeah, that was a civil war. It counts. And even Augustus can't really rewrite history well enough to write civil war out of his own military experience. But it's also part of why Augustus is a man that few, if any, people are willing to stand up to. He's killed before to maintain his power, and he will again, or so the threat is here. After Augustus's death, the statue was still in Livia's house because her son Tiberius was the next emperor, and she continued to act for him in the same way she'd acted for Augustus, because Tiberius didn't have a living wife anymore because he starved his last wife to death. It's a long story. You can Google it if you're really interested, but the slide's already long again. Where I'm going with this is that Augustus had to bill himself as an action hero when his action hero resume was a little bit thin. Part of how he does it is with art, and part of how he does it is this 1-2 punch where he both says, hey, look, I saved the Republic from civil war by winning civil war, but then he also goes on to say, and I'm such a good leader that I then transitioned into peacetime leader. I restored the Republic, I gave it back to you guys, and now I'm not in charge. I'm just the first citizen. It's not that I'm holding the Senate at sword point anymore. It's that they just respect me so much, they ask me for their advice. Of course, while all of this was going on, Augustus made a big show of restoring some of the institutions of the old governmental system, while quietly phasing out others. He began to take direct control over certain aspects of the court system, a process that his successors would continue with unimpeded. So much so that we talk about a massive change in the courtroom procedure around this time, from decentralized forms of lawsuit filing to this cognitio extra ordinem, this hearing in front of a single magistrate, culminating in an appeal to the emperor. So there's direct control of the legal system now. Permanent direct control, not just you're the praetor this year direct control. Also, he quietly phased out the citizen assembly. There are few times when the Roman citizen body gets together to vote on policy, but not that many. By the time we turn the millennium from the end of years BCE into the first year CE, the citizen assembly is effectively gone. It's there when you vote for your senator, and that's about it. It starts feeling a lot more like the way we do elections, where on a local level, our vote still matters on individual issues, but on a national level, we, frustratingly or not, depending on how you feel about this, every 4 years we get to have an opinion, and then it's just call your senator every week for the duration. He bills this, I mentioned, as a restoration, totally not a revolution. And part of how he sells this is by throwing some bones to the upper class. He doesn't abolish debt in the way that a lot of other politicians of the late Republic were willing to. This was a disappointment to some, to others they were fairly cool with it. He also starts using his household staff to run aspects of the government. This really concerns senators, but a lot of the common people like it because it reduces the amount of disproportionate influence that elites can have over the legal process and also over taxation and policy. For a lot of folks, the actual policies coming out of Augustus's regime felt like populace favorable measures and limits on high power, just not Augustus's high power. He's also very into promoting his particular take on pietas. One of the things he pushes really hard is that why the Republic ultimately failed in the crisis of the late Republic was because they forgot their family values. They stopped caring about uh, Rome as a divinely destined community and cared a lot more about their own personal glory. Now, how he reconciled this with Julius Caesar's glory houndom is difficult, but politicians love to contradict themselves. That's normal. Additionally, he was really focused on policing people's sexual behavior. And it was in this arena that a lot of his opposition was particularly vocal. At one point, this led to a mass of deportations and exiles, including his own daughter. His daughter, Julia, gets accused of and convicted for serial adultery and then is exiled to a small island. When her ex-spouse Tiberius gets to be emperor, he stops sending her food and she dies. Oh, see, I did talk about that. Oh well, there we are. Tiberius, however, is just a massive dipshit to Julia. It's unfair. But then so's her dad. But it's not just Julia who goes, and it might not just have been about sex. We have stories from a couple ancient authors about protests that Julia participated in. It seems that she became part of her own father's opposition in a way that became too high profile to ignore. Along with her seems to have gone poets, intellectuals, intellectual leaders, artists, the usual people who get into trouble with free speech in an increasingly restrictive political environment. Be that as it may, Augustus's idea of pietas, of this devotion to country and gods first, and then your family, but only if your family supports country, and he's the country now, so you see where this is going, is a governing feature of how Virgil structures his national epic. So it's something to look out for, both in the Res Gestae and in Virgil's Aeneid. You've already read another piece of literature from this period, though, Livy. Livy's also writing under Augustus, and you've seen how Livy treats pietas, yeah? This obsession with pietas comes from the top, and it has the same kind of resonance that, say, saying terror in the 2000s would have had resonance in art and film. Anything else I want to say about that? Yeah, one more thing. Part of how early Augustus defines pietas is in relation to the assassination of Caesar. Remember, Augustus gets to be Augustus partly because he inherits Caesar's property and Caesar's will. And he makes a big deal out of being Julius Caesar's son, adopted son, but he would get really horked off if you called him anything but Caesar's son. This is confusing sometimes in history because historians will call both Julius and Augustus Caesar Caesar. If your entire power is based out of this idea that you care so much about your dead adopted father that you're willing to first hunt down his assassins to the ends of the earth, which is what he does first, and then turn on your father's right-hand man, which is what Antonius was to Caesar, because he's no longer upholding the ideals of your father. Like, Augustus uses this I am the heir of Caesar construct to drive most of his early career for very important reasons. Caesar had an army, and Augustus gets Caesar's men to follow him, in some cases over and above a Roman who's actually led them, which Antonius had, right? Antonius had led Caesar's troops before. Antonius was also a high-functioning alcoholic who had some high-profile military disasters that ended up just crippling his ability to leverage the army's loyalty. But this is something that Augustus invests in early and often. Augustus, however, is unusual as autocrats go because he lives long enough to outlive his Civil War generation. The Civil War effectively ends in 31 BCE. In 28 BCE, when the Senate votes him the title Augustus and he officially gives up his power, doesn't actually give up his power, but claims to give up his power. He dies in 14 CE, so he's in power for 40-ish years. Yeah, that is a really long time to be in power. And this means that when he dies, there's an entire generation that vaguely remembers the civil wars, but never knew a leader other than Augustus. They're used to him, and they've grown up in this world where everyone bends their opinion to survive with Augustus in charge. Never underestimate the value of longevity. And this means that the generation that's active in running the country when Augustus dies and Tiberius eventually is awarded his constitutional powers is a generation that themselves, at least most of them, hadn't fought in the Civil War. Augustus hurt their parents, but didn't necessarily hurt them. And by now, Augustus had had a good 40 years to effectively brainwash them. And that's how you win, is you just live a really long time and stick around and make yourself very, very useful. Which is the trick that dictators miss. It's not all fun and games and bossing people around. That's a good way to get to be a dead dictator. You have to invest some time into making it worth your supporters' while. I don't know who needs to hear that, but use it for good. At any rate, he's trying to do a lot of throwback family values. And there's limited success with this, because as much as he wants to turn back the clock on Roman social behavior, it's now been 70-ish years since Catullus was writing, long enough for people to get really disillusioned with this militaristic model of masculinity. Even Augustus has stepped away from this a bit with his insistence on peacetime values. Which brings us to our next item. Civil war is out, but that doesn't mean that Augustus is a pacifist, even though he brags about the Roman world being at peace for the first time in forever when he's in charge. It's brief. Augustus almost immediately turns his eye to the borders of his territory because he realizes that part of what Rome wants from their leaders is expansion. And at one point he oversteps. He tries to make inroads into Germania, which is not exactly the same as the modern nation-state Germany, so I'm going to call it Germania, the territory across the Rhine. And it leads to military disaster. 3 legions are lured into the Teutoburg forest and killed almost to a man, except for this one guy. This tough-as-nails centurion called Cassius Chaerea manages to take his cohort, lead them out of Germania, and survive to bring the news back to Augustus that 3 legions are gone and all of the eagles, those standards the legions carry, have been lost. It is a public relations disaster. Augustus never quite manages to do the foreign expansion thing as much as he wanted. It's something that Rome keeps trying to do for the next century or so with varying degrees of success. You wouldn't know this to look at the Primaporta Augustus, though. Have a look at his armor, like on his six-pack there, his abs. It's hard to see in this picture. I haven't done a detailed close-up, but there are 2 human figures. There's this one tiny dude in armor, and then there's this other guy who's holding some kind of a stick up. That's not just any stick. That's Crassus's lost eagle. You remember Crassus, right? Crassus is Moneybags dude from the first Civil War, the first triumvirate. He's the guy who went to Parthia and lost his legion and got gold poured down his throat. That Crassus, yeah? He lost an eagle. And one of the first foreign relation successes under Augustus's reign was that he sent his stepson, the future Emperor Tiberius, to go to Parthia and negotiate to get the eagle back. This was a political rather than military victory, but it was really important symbolically, because Augustus was all about symbolic acts of vengeance and restitution to undo the most embarrassing moments from the last century or so. And Crassus getting his ass handed to him was super duper embarrassing, even though Crassus had it coming. And it's not like Caesar liked him much anyway. Nonetheless, Tiberius gets that eagle back, and it's a major diplomatic victory. And even after Augustus loses 3 more eagles in Germania, this is the image he chooses to show. And for his supporters, they don't see a lot of cognitive dissonance there. They're like, oh, okay, yeah, Augustus got the eagle back. Yay, go Augustus. It becomes socially unacceptable to express a reluctance to serve in foreign wars and to engage in acts of conquest and subjugation. One of the things I find life-giving about this period is that even with so much pressure to conform to this model of masculinity, that real Roman men kill and enslave foreigners, a lot of Roman men were like, hell no, that's toxic, that's destructive, we're not going for it. So Catullus's legacy survives for a while, and despite the fact that some of these voices end up getting exiled, the poet Ovid's one of them, others do pretty well under Augustus. Virgil in particular has a very complicated relationship with conquest and militarism. This is partly why we're looking at it. So second to last thing, Augustus was really into the appearance of a certain amount of free speech. Now, there was no First Amendment in ancient Rome, right? There was no right to free speech officially. However, there was an expectation that a freeborn Roman citizen should have the freedom to speak his mind as long as he was speaking truth. This goes into early versions of what later becomes libel law, which is a complicated rabbit hole I won't take you down today. Augustus made a big show of supporting people's right to disagree with him, but only to a point. And he also did a lot to promote voices who were willing to agree with him in eloquent and complicated ways. A lot of the credit for this goes to Augustus's bro, a guy named Maecenas. He's one of Augustus's inner circle. Maecenas ends up managing a circle of poets and authors and artists. We've seen this in the late Republic, and this is a thing that upper-class Romans do. But Maecenas was sponsored by Augustus, and the poets that he championed ended up getting from Augustus country estates and their bills paid and lots of free time to write. One of these authors is Virgil. Virgil in many ways was one of the most successful authors. Now, interestingly, the poem we're about to read, Virgil's Aeneid, we're not reading the whole thing, we're just bits, was that when Virgil died, he wasn't quite done with the Aeneid. He was still tinkering with it. A couple of lines remain unfinished as part of this process. So he asked that the poem be burnt. Apparently, Augustus saw an early draft and overrode that request, saying, no, the people need to be able to read this. This is important. This is good art. Either because he realized that, yeah, it's good art, and it's good art. it just is. It's wonderful. Or perhaps Augustus didn't notice some of the subtle ways that Virgil's poem critiques certain elements of Augustus's version of Roman values and Roman priorities. As a bridge, then, to talking about Virgil from Augustus, I want to draw your attention to one last feature of the Primaporta Augustus. You may have wondered why there's a little naked baby next to his ankle. You may have also noticed where are his shoes. That is an interesting question. There's a lot of debate about this, but gods are often shown not wearing sandals, so this might be a little bit of divine posturing. Augustus gets away with this, however, because of a legend that he didn't invent. This is part of his family's backstory. You may remember from early lectures that Aeneas had a son who had two different names, Ascanius or Iulus. Through Iulus, Aeneas is the ancestor of Julius Caesar's family. Julius is like Iulus, Julius. It's a later version of the same name. And Aeneas's mom is the goddess Venus. So if Venus is Augustus's mom, many generations removed, then Augustus's brother, I guess technically cousin, is the god Eros, Venus's other son, the divine son, the god of sexual desire. Now, this caused Augustus a little bit of embarrassment because he was a family values guy, right? He was really into this idea that you don't cheat on your spouse, you're not an adulterer, you have to behave yourself, you need to get, like, he mandated that upper class Romans get married and have babies. He's also the author of the law of 3 children, that thing that gives women perks for having extra babies. And this gave his opponents a field day because they loved to go for this as a weak spot in Augustus's rhetoric, saying, oh my gosh, for a slut shamer, you certainly do have a very interesting family lineage, Augustus. But that's part of what he has to do because his family already had this backstory. He couldn't invent it. So he leans into this idea that, oh yeah, I'm related to the gods, Aeneas is my ancestor, the god Eros, he's my brother. If you look at the very back of that little scary looking baby thing, you can see one of his wings. That's how you know it's Eros, the god, and not just a random baby hanging off of Augustus's knee. This wasn't just about Augustus, though. One of the ways in which Augustus went about claiming power was that he moved for and won the right to deify Julius Caesar. And then he created a religion around the worship of Julius Caesar. He endowed temples, he created a whole priestly college, and he went for this idea that when Julius Caesar was burned on his funeral pyre, a spark was seen floating up into the sky to take its place in Olympus, and therefore that was the proof that Julius Caesar was a god. And if Julius Caesar was a god, then Augustus wasn't just this great grandson of a goddess. No, Augustus was the adopted son / nephew of a literal god. Now, he wasn't during his lifetime saying he was a god. He was just like, my uncle Julius, who is also my dad, he's a god. I'm just, first citizen. But it let him have his cake and eat it too. This is something that his descendants are going to lean into. And it's not a coincidence that when Augustus dies, his successor, Tiberius, moves for and wins the deification of Augustus. So sometimes you'll hear him called the divine Augustus in ancient sources. He gets deified too. And it's something that Virgil in his poem nods to. So it was coming for a long time. It's not as ridiculous as it sounds. We're going to unpack it a little bit later, but just suffice to say for now that there's a lot going on in this statue. Augustus is emphasizing what he's done for his country, so the country part of pietas is there. There's the family element. This is a portrait in his family's house that his family is using to claim a relationship to the divine. And then also with the inclusion of the no shoes thing and then little baby Eros, he's hitting 2 points at once. He's saying, I honor the gods. I worship the gods. Oh, by the way, I'm related to them, so they're my family too. So I am like the most pietas dude in this entire civilization here. So that's what we're contending with. Okay. There's Augustus. Finally now, we're going to move into Virgil. Oh, not finally. Let me remind you, by the way, that there are 2 titles that emperors are claiming. And here I'm not showing you Augustus, I'm showing you Tiberius. So this is emperor number 2. And notice there are some specific differences, but also similarities. The portrait on the left, you see Tiberius looking a lot like the Primaporta Augustus. There are a couple key differences, though. Now, his hand is in a similar gesture. This is what we see in art showing generals addressing their troops. This kind of hand up, attention, look at me gesture. He's wearing armor, like Augustus was, but he's wearing boots. He doesn't have arrows hanging off his ankle. He's de-emphasized his divine relations, in part because he doesn't have to work as hard as Augustus. First, he's got Augustus's power, but also Tiberius, unlike Augustus, was a career military officer. He was a very competent general who did a lot of very useful troop management along the Rhine frontier particularly. His troops were proud to be commanded by him. I'm hesitating because they also complained a lot that he was a really harsh commander, but Roman troops seem to also respect that. On the right, you have another kind of portrait, which is Tiberius in a toga, apparently a wet toga. Like, you can see way too much of Tiberius's thigh in here. Here, he's showing himself as a humble first citizen. When you're commanding your troops, your hand is up. That's a power gesture. But here, when he's talking to the senators, his hand is at a medium level. That's what you do if you're asking for them to listen to you like an equal. It's a posture that's paying lip service to this concept of first among equals, this first citizen, some animals are more equal than others kind of concept. These both give us names for modern rulers, by the way. Princeps is the root of the word prince. Imperator, of course, gives us emperor. Imperator is used for the military commander-in-chief. Princeps is used for the political first citizen. Tiberius leans really heavily into both of these titles. Okay, so that's what you need to know about Augustus, his legacy, and his heir. Now we need to talk about Virgil. Publius Vergilius Maro is his name in Latin. His friends wouldn't have called him Vergil. That's a modern nickname. It's fine. You can call him that. It's just this is his whole name. This isn't the only thing he ever wrote. The Aeneid is an epic poem. It's the last of his surviving works. But we have the Georgics, the Eclogues. He was a very prolific poet and a real master of the craft. One of the greatest treats that comes from learning Latin is having the chance to read Virgil in Latin. He's a master of the language, and it's absolutely beautiful. So Virgil was born around 70 BCE, just to orient ourselves here. 81 BCE is Sulla's reign of terror, Sulla's dictatorship. 11 years after that, Virgil is born. 70 is few years, I'm trying to remember, Spartacus, yeah, I think it's a few years after or during Spartacus's revolt, we get into the 60s. No, the 60s is Spartacus's revolt. There's the consulship of Crassus and Pompey, and then in 63, Cicero's consulship. And then in the year 60, when Virgil is 10, Julius Caesar's consulship. In the year 50, when Virgil is 20 and old enough to go into military service, Caesar is just returning home from his Gallic campaigns, and civil war between Caesar and Pompey is breaking out. 49, 48, 46, 47. Caesar's assassinated in 44 when Virgil's in his mid-20s. When Virgil's in his 40s, the Second Triumvirate is forming, and the Republic is leaning into its final civil war between Antonius and Octavian. He dies in 19 BCE, so he's sponsored by Augustus shortly after Augustus becomes Augustus. That's in the year 28 BCE. And then Virgil has about 10-ish years before his death in 19. As I mentioned, the Aeneid is published posthumously. It's his last work. I've included a coin from the reign of Augustus. Now, it may look like it's Julius Caesar because it says very clearly on the side Caesar, but remember Julius Caesar adopted Augustus, so Augustus's name is also Caesar. We know that this is Augustus because he's leaning heavily into his ancestor Aeneas, the lumpy-looking naked dude who's carrying an older dude on his back and holds this statue of a goddess in his hand. That's the goddess Minerva. You may know her as Athena also. Is Aeneas fleeing Troy, carrying his father and his household gods. So this is Augustus very firmly positioning himself as this champion of pietas, this Roman from Romans, and this guy who has a divine right to be where he is. It's this image that begins Virgil's Aeneid. It's set in the time of Augustus's ancestor Aeneas, but it's written under Augustus, and it really shows in the way that Augustus is writing, or not Augustus, sorry, Virgil is writing his Aeneas fan fiction, which is essentially what this is. It's an expansion of stuff that's already in the epic cycle. Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey contains bits and pieces of the plot. This is normal. Pretty much all literature from the ancient world is some kind of fan fiction. Fan fiction has a bad name today, but it used to be the mainstream writing style. So that's what Virgil is doing here. But because he knows what's going to happen under Augustus, and because he's, at least on the surface of the poem, promoting Augustus as our revered, fearless leader with a divine right to be where he is, the characters in Virgil's Aeneid will regularly have these bursts of prophecy from the gods where they're like, oh yes, Aeneas, you are fated to be the father of a great dynasty, and your ancestor is going to rule the entire Mediterranean. And if you forget when it was written, you might be reading this and be like, oh, wow, this is so prescient. It's like they know what happens under Augustus. Well, it is, because they do know what happened under Augustus. That's the point. But you're missing a trick if you look at Virgil as simple propaganda. In fact, this is a preconception that a lot of modern people have about propaganda. Propaganda, if you're unfamiliar, is a word that we use to describe works of art that are made with the support of a powerful political regime in order to promote that regime's legislative or social agenda, or to create a useful image for that regime. Other things that count as propaganda would be like patriotic posters that show images of, say, America as we wish America was rather than as America sometimes is. Norman Rockwell is a good example of this. A lot of what he's doing is this idealized vision of America meant to cause Americans to galvanize around a political agenda, mostly Roosevelt, and eventually resistance to the Axis in World War II. Sure, you can think of other examples. They're all over the place, and oppositions can write propaganda too. Now, because a lot of propaganda tends to be art that's produced for reasons other than the artist's personal inspiration, although not always. Sometimes the artist is a huge fan and it's just a tribute work written by a fan. In fact, like the literature surrounding Ruth Bader Ginsburg could fall into this category too. This doesn't mean that it's not good art, though. We're actually missing a lot if we think that propaganda can't be wonderful art. Can be. Whether it's supporting a regime that you find morally reprehensible or not. Part of really good effective propaganda is that it's satisfying as art. It grips you, it resonates, it reaches something inside the people it's aiming to reach for. The really, really good propaganda, however, as I will argue, you can disagree with me, I won't be too offended. A part of what makes Virgil nifty is that it's propaganda that leaves space for the existence of opposition, in that it gives voice to the feelings of people on both sides of a civil war. And it gets away with this because it's not set literally in Augustus's civil war. It's set in the distant, distant past. And it uses that as a way to get complicated rhetorical gestures under the radar. And I'll show you what I mean by this with some concrete examples moving ahead. So just wait for the proof of this one here. And that's why there is a question mark at the end of the point about Aeneas justifying Augustus. Because a simple reading of the Aeneid says, okay, Aeneas, the character, is a stand-in for Augustus. And because Aeneas looks good, those feelings of national pride are going to transfer themselves onto Augustus. But there's a question mark because Aeneas, the character, does some shady shit that gets called out within the poem itself. So it's not just stuff that an outside observer says, hey, wait a minute, that's some complicated behavior. But characters in the Aeneid itself call out Aeneas, they argue against him, and Virgil the poet makes them sympathetic. He makes them convincing. Some of the most satisfying characters in this epic are the characters that become collateral damage as Aeneas searches out his fate. But it's not just that, because part of what happens to Aeneas as this poem goes on is that he slowly, gradually becomes disillusioned and angry, because Aeneas is doing things to please the gods that destroy him on a personal level. He's asked to give up people he loves, to walk away from places where he feels happy, to step outside of comfortable areas, and to go into danger. And the gods keep giving him a little bit of information, but not enough information, so that he keeps going step after step along this journey, only to find after he takes that step and it's too late, that horrible things are in store for him on the other side of that decision. Aeneas, at the end of the poem, is a very different person than he is at the beginning of the poem. And the poem ends on a really dark note, so watch out for this. This is partly one of many reasons I love this. Final, oh yeah, then that's my last point too. Propaganda can be subversive, and subversion can also serve as propaganda. Good art has multiple meanings to it. It connects with a variety of people because a variety of people are going to glom on to different parts of the fandom to love and to root for. So it's not so much looking at it as an either-or proposition, as some scholars have done in the past, but to look at this as a very complicated poem. Because Virgil, remember, he's not just a survivor of the successful side of the Civil War. Generations, plural, of his friends chose the wrong side in a variety of civil wars, as indeed every adult male who survives the first century can say in this culture. And just because you're on the winning side of a civil war, it doesn't mean that you're immune from angst. Just because you win a civil war doesn't mean that you were not harmed by your participation in that civil war. Virgil, more than most, he's given a farm by Augustus. By farm, I mean like plantation estate, together with human beings to run it for him. And he has to sit with the fact that he himself is profiting off of the deaths of people on the other side of a civil war. One can't help but be affected by that. Even if you're in total denial, you're going to be affected by that. And don't disillusion me, because I really need to believe that about humanity right now. All of this we can see in the way Virgil goes about writing the story of Aeneas. So without any further ado, let's get into it, shall we? The rest of this lecture is going to be a helpful summary to help you orient yourself inside the bits of the Aeneid that I've given you to read, because it's very long. I don't feel like I can make you read the whole thing. It's also a very difficult story to read the whole of. So here's the basic concept. Starting with the first line in Latin, Arma virumque cano, I sing about arms and a man. Arma is exactly what it looks like, arms. Virum gives us virile, that means a dude. And vir is very gendered, right? So this isn't I sing about arms and a human being, it's I sing about arms and a manly man. The poem goes on to say that his plot arc is that he's a refugee, he comes to Italy, and then he has to fight and struggle in order to set up the circumstances that will eventually lead to Rome. So right from the outset, the poem tells us that this is a refugee story, it's a displacement story, it's a trauma story, it's a war story. There's another interesting feature to this. The villain, and this is unusual for epic, although not unheard of, is Juno, the queen of the gods, and she's in direct opposition to her husband, Jupiter. Right at the outset, you have a house divided. You have gods who are not engaging in textbook pietas, and the tension between them is part of why Aeneas is having such a hard time. Because Jupiter's job is to make sure that fate happens the way fate should happen. So he's really interested in just getting Aeneas out of Troy and into Italy to found Rome. Juno, however, has other ideas. Juno is really fond of Carthage. You remember Carthage, that Carthage. Not only that, but she's directly responsible as the sponsoring goddess of Carthage's first queen, a queen named Alyssa or Dido. Juno finds out that Aeneas is not only fated to found this new empire and to continue the legacy of Troy, but that eventually his country, Rome, is going to destroy her country, Carthage. And she is super pissed off about this. Because as much as Jupiter loves the concept of future Rome, Juno is really invested in the future of Carthage. So this is a situation in which the gods are divided because they've chosen different sides in a war. So from the outset, choosing pietas in this world is impossible. But Aeneas, his defining characteristic is pietas. And this is part of what's going to end up turning him from a hopeful, loyal friend, husband, and warrior into a bitter, angry, violent man. Spoilers, that's where this is going. Now, as much as Juno is one linchpin of this plot, she's out to keep Aeneas from doing what he's going to have to do. Aeneas's mom, Venus, is his patron goddess, his patrona dea, in all of the senses of a patronus for Romans, right? She is Aeneas's sponsor, his advocate, his cheerleader, his practical help giver. Like at one point he loses his armor and Venus quick gets her ex-husband Hephaestus to make him a new set. Not Hephaestus, sorry, this is Roman Vulcan. This is a scene from a Pompeian fresco showing Aeneas at a critical point at the end of the poem where he's been wounded and he has to take time out and the doctor is pulling an arrow out of his thigh, and then Venus shows up and really quick puts a plant on the wound and it heals really fast. Now, there's a problem here. Venus is notoriously unhelpful in war, and this is a war poem. Aeneas's tasks are all war tasks. Juno kind of is too. Juno's a marriage goddess. Now, not just marriage qua marriage, but marriage is about political alliances in these cultures. Juno is about marrying you to the right person in order to cement alliances and create stability through family. Between the two of them, this ends up leading to some decisions that causes Aeneas pain and harm. Venus, because she's the goddess of sexy times and sexiness and sexual attraction, ends up causing a lot of problems too, because if you're a sex goddess, your solutions to every problem are going to look a lot like sex, which is not that helpful sometimes when your priorities have to revolve around war and dynasty building. So Aeneas from the outset is kind of screwed. His enemy is the goddess who could make this a lot easier for him by getting him into a marriage with the right woman. His patron goddess is not a goddess of stability, but a goddess of sexual attraction. Sexual attraction is not necessarily evil for Romans or anyone, but it is something that can be very destabilizing. And this is true for Aeneas. It's also an interesting choice that gets at the heart of what makes it so hard for Augustus to function as a moral religious authority. That authority comes from, well, Venus, who is the goddess of everything that Augustus sets himself against, which is an interesting choice. Okay, so that's our scene setting. Here I'm going to go not in the order that the poem goes in, but in chronological order from beginning to the end of the plot. The poem, like a lot of epics, starts in the middle of the story, not at the beginning. And this part of the story is told in a flashback. Aeneas's origin story comes out of the city of Troy. You're probably familiar, but if you're not, this is a city in modern-day Turkey, and it's a city doomed from the outset. However, it's doomed because fate decrees that it's going to have to fall, but gods take different sides in the war for it. The gods who don't like Troy are super powerful, and they also have a personal reason, because the trouble not all starts, but mostly starts with a dispute over which of three goddesses is the prettiest. And they get a dude from the city of Troy, a guy named Paris, who's the son of the king, to judge this no-win scenario, beauty contest. And he overlooks Minerva and Juno in favor of Venus, because Venus promises him the most beautiful woman in the world. Of course, she doesn't mention that the most beautiful woman in the world is married, and all of her relatives have sworn to defend the marriage, which ends up getting Troy into a pickle. The poem introduces us to Aeneas, well, not the poem, but the plot introduces us to Aeneas at the moment when the city of Troy finally falls, not through direct confrontation, but through a trick. The Greeks build a large wooden horse. Through various means, they get the Trojans to bring the horse inside the city walls. When it's dark and all the Trojans are drunk because they're super happy the war is over and the Greeks are gone, a couple of Greeks crawl out of the horse, they unlock the city gates, and then when everybody wakes up, Troy's in the process of being burned down and sacked and falling, which is partly how Virgil gets around the inconvenience of Aeneas running away from the city he's sworn to protect, but also being this icon of pietas. He makes it so that the gods basically order Aeneas to, look, take your countrymen, take the survivors, get them out of Troy, and bring them to a new country. Your city is a lost cause. There's nothing you can do. The gods are against you. The only thing that pietas lets you do in this situation is to take your out and leave. But in the process, and that's why I've chosen this art, you can see all the characters involved. Aeneas is carrying his father. His free hand is holding on to his kid, but he's got a wife when this happens. He can't hold on to her too, so he has her follow behind him. But they get separated as he's fleeing the city, and he doesn't notice until she's gone. By the time he runs back to get her, she's dead. Her ghost shows up and says, hey, dude, sorry, I'm dead now. Good news, you're free to marry again, and you're going to make a great political alliance when you go to found New Troy. So cheer up, don't be sad, off you go, good luck. You may take it from my tone that I'm irritated by this plot point, and I am a little bit, but I think that Virgil means you to be. This is the first of many moments where Aeneas has a personal loss that the demands of pietas force him to move on from without processing it. And to a Roman, your wife isn't part of your family, she's part of her father's family, so it's not necessarily against pietas that he loses his wife in the sacking of the city, although it kind of is a little bit. But nonetheless, the poem acknowledges that Aeneas feels horrible about this, and he has no time to process it, as indeed survivors of war don't. This is part of what Virgil gets so right in his poem, is that when you have to flee your homeland, when you're a refugee, when you're getting out of a violent, dangerous situation, you don't have time to process. You have to drop things and run and go to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And then the full force of what you've had to do doesn't hit you until much later than the events. This is a first moment among many when Aeneas is forced to function after a devastating loss. And it's only going to get worse for him as the poem goes on. Now we get to the beginning of the poem, sort of. After the fall of Troy, the gods string Aeneas on with increasingly specific information about where he's supposed to found his new Troy. This is his sea voyage itinerary. You notice he bounces around a lot. He doesn't go straight for Italy, but first he's on Delos, and then he's on Crete. He's bouncing around a lot, and he keeps trying to found New Troy, and it keeps not working out, and then the gods will be like, oh, dude, sorry, I guess we weren't specific enough. You need to, go west. Oh, by west, we mean, not Greece. Oh, by not Greece, we mean you have to go to, the greater Italy area. Oh, wait, by Italy area, we mean, Latium. Now, if you would find it really irritating when someone keeps giving you directions and the first directions are super vague, and then you try to course correct and you get slightly less vague directions and you have to keep like redoing your project, then you get a little bit of Aeneas's frustration in all of this. Another frustration is that the gods are following the rules of pietas a bit. They're communicating more with Aeneas's dad, Anchises, than they are with Aeneas directly. And this means there's a little bit of a telephone game going on. Now, eventually, Aeneas's dad dies, and then they have to bury him and leave his body behind. And it's a really problematic moment that tears Aeneas up. So much so that one of the first people he looks for when he has a chance to go to the Underworld, just a side note, if you're a hero in the ancient world, you have to go to the Underworld. It's what you do. He looks for his dad, and seeing his dad in the Underworld doesn't make him feel much better because he has to leave him behind again. So he loses his father twice. His father, whom he adores, this is the man he carries out of Troy, the parent who raised him, because Venus did not raise Aeneas. We know this from another bit of ancient poetry. She gives birth to him, she drops him off with some nymphs until he's weaned, and then sticks him with his dad, who then raises him as a single father. Aeneas's pietas isn't just pietas because duty. It's a pietas that comes from this deep connection and the sense of us against the world. But he also has this young son that he has to raise and he has to think of. Part of pietas is not just about being a good son, but then when it's your turn to be paterfamilias, you have to be a good paterfamilias. You have to deny yourself and your personal desires in order to make a better life for your kid and your descendants. Aeneas doesn't get to found Rome. Anchises doesn't get to found Rome, for that matter. He founds Alba Longa. It's Romulus and Remus who found Rome. So neither Aeneas nor his son see any of the things they're promised in all of these prophecies. That informs a lot of the anger at the end of this poem, I think. But it's also something that would have been relatable for the first century audience. The first century audience is the last in a string of generations who've lived through civil war. And you choose your sides in a civil war not just because you think Caesar is cool or you're a Pompey fan person. You choose sides in a civil war because of family connections, because of your social network, your parental politics. And even if you break with your parents' politics, this happens in civil wars, right? Sons join a side other than their father's side, but then that means that sons and fathers are going to war with each other. If you're on the side or not on the same side, it's still traumatic, super traumatic. For the first century audience, it would have been so relatable, this push and pull between your duty to your family and your own personal beliefs. All of this informs the beginning of the poem. When Virgil first introduces us to Aeneas, he's on the sea, sailing from Sicily, from Drepanum, and he thinks he's going to Italy. Like, he's on the last leg, he's nearly there, he can see the coast almost. Super exciting. And then Juno pops up and she's like, oh my god, I can't believe he's gotten so far. I turn my back for an instant and Aeneas gets to go to Italy. No, this is not happening. I can't stand this. So she goes to the King of the Winds. She orders a sea storm. And this is how Aeneas ends up washed onto the shores of Carthage. Yeah, that Carthage. This narrative tactic is called in medias res, which is Latin for in the middle of the thing. It's really popular in epic. You see it a lot. It's in Homer, both Iliad and the Odyssey. The Aeneid does it. Does the Argonautica do it? It's been a while since I've read that. It's common, at any rate. This brings us to Carthage, the next stop at the beginning of the Aeneid. Now, Carthage, as I mentioned earlier, is Juno's alternative to Rome. Jupiter is super into Rome, but there is no Rome yet. Juno, however, has already been working, and it's part of why she's so angry about this whole thing, is she's put in time and money, well, not money because she's a goddess, but time and divine investment into Carthage. It's already founded, they're building it, and what they're building looks a lot like an alternative universe for Rome. The first thing they build is a Senate house and a forum, and all of the public buildings that would have been familiar to Augustus's Rome. Not in small part because Augustus himself, one of the things he did to gain goodwill in Rome after the civil wars was he poured massive amounts of money into rebuilding and building new buildings in downtown Rome. He built a new Senate house, he built new court buildings, he upgraded the forum, he put in all of these improvements. He'll brag about this in the Res Gestae. There's a famous line where he says he found Rome a city made out of bricks and he left it a city made out of marble. This isn't necessarily wrong, but part of how he was able to build so many buildings is that other Romans started the process. I mentioned Pompey's theater in the last lecture. Antonius began a lot of the buildings that Augustus finishes and then claims credit for. So he doesn't invent the concept of paying money to build nifty buildings, but it's a big part of how he's gaining hearts and minds in the city of Rome. And when we see Juno's Carthage and Queen Dido building it, we're seeing a few things. They're building the same buildings that Rome was in the process of renovating when Virgil wrote. They're building a city that looks a lot like the city of Rome, as indeed Carthage did. Carthage had a senate. Carthage had a city layout that was similar in many ways to Rome's. They had gods, they had worship, they had a sense of pietas. Rome and Carthage had a lot alike between the two of them. But certain details are different. For instance, Carthage is ruled by a woman. Not unheard of in the ancient world, but kind of unusual. So you may ask yourself, gee, where did Virgil get this idea? Well, some of it's obvious. He didn't invent the story that Carthage was founded by Queen Dido. That was part of the story Virgil had. But he didn't have to choose to show her to us and make her sympathetic, which is what he does. Not only that, but Dido is a foreign queen who, when Aeneas shows up, is doing much better than Aeneas is at founding a city. Aeneas by now has tried and failed to found several new Carthages, whereas Dido is exiled from her homeland. Her brother murders her husband, and she flees for her life with all of her followers. So like Aeneas, she's a refugee. But she lands in North Africa, negotiates for the territory, and starts immediately building, and has created a functioning small city-state. Whereas Aeneas is still on a boat getting lost in sea storms. Dido is a little bit more effective than Aeneas is, and that's interesting. Not only that, but the way that the tension between Dido and Aeneas is resolved, because both Venus and Juno are worried that Aeneas is now in contact with Dido. Venus strikes this deal with Juno. She says, okay, I know how we can fix this. Let's make Dido and Aeneas fall in love. Especially Dido. Let's make Dido fall in love with Aeneas, and then he'll stay and hang out with Dido. She won't kill him. Everybody wins. And Juno's like, awesome. I'm down for this. I will totally sign off on this marriage. Now, Dido thinks it's a marriage. Aeneas, however, it becomes clear as the poem goes on, does not. I'll give you a minute to think about what events of the 1st century BCE this might remind you of. Say, events that happened when Virgil was in his late 20s, early 30s. Remember when Mark Antony, was given the right to govern the Eastern Mediterranean, and when he ran into one of the local queens named Cleopatra VII and realized that her kingdom was doing really well, and then started living with her and having babies with her and supporting her legislative agenda. Remember that? That's a lot like what seems to be going on with Aeneas, and isn't it interesting? Because in this reading, Aeneas is acting a lot like not Augustus. He's acting like Mark Antony. That's cool, and that's tricky. Now, Virgil never comes out and says, much like Antonius and Cleopatra, Dido and Aeneas canoodle with each other. No, he's better than that. But it's enough that if you lived through that civil war, and everybody in the first generation reading Virgil had, and in the next couple generations their dads had, their grandpas, it's an inescapable thing in Roman history, that comparison isn't lost on them. And it's a moment where Aeneas is given an impossible choice, because the two goddesses who are there, his mom and his archenemy Juno, seem to be telling him, hey, here's Dido, we want you guys to get together. This is what we meant. Hang out with her, it'll be cool. Only months into the relationship, Jupiter figures out that this is going on. Jupiter apparently has not been checking his emails. Jupiter then swoops in, sends his messenger to Aeneas, and is like, dude, what are you doing? I told you to go to Italy. Why aren't you in Italy? Dump your girlfriend right now, get on a boat, and go to Italy. Now keep in mind, again, Romans don't see anything wrong with divorce, but also Aeneas doesn't seem to think this is a real marriage. And contemporary Romans would understand this, because in order to have the right to intermarry, you both need Roman citizenship. Now, there's some debate over whether Cleopatra VII had it or not, but the fact remained that Cleopatra VII was Egyptian, and Antonius was not. In the same way, Aeneas is a proto-Roman, and Dido is a proto-Carthaginian. So in Aeneas's mind, he's like, oh, this is fun, this is awesome, but now I have to go. Dido, however, thought this was forever. She thought there were certain promises, and she feels awful because she was actually legit in love with her husband. What she feels for Aeneas, the gods put into her. Venus sends the god of sexual desire, Eros, down in a disguise. She dresses him up like little baby Ascanius, Aeneas' son, and then makes him sit on Dido's lap, and then, like, super sneaky like, forces Dido to feel sexual attraction and love for Aeneas. Dido doesn't get to really consent, right? Like, that's not consent. In fact, Dido fights it. She's like, look, I promised that I'd remain faithful to my first husband, Zacchaeus, the guy who got murdered. I love him. What's going on here? But the gods are arrayed against her. She breaks her personal vow. She dates Aeneas, and then Aeneas dumps her publicly in front of her entire state. And this is the first century, yes. There are women rulers who are very effective in the first century, but this doesn't make misogyny go away. They're held to a different standard, and Dido is humiliated. She realizes that her ability to rule has been fatally compromised. Not only that, but she's had her consent overridden, and she is distraught. At this point, things become very depressing. She decides that she's going to take her own life, indeed much like Cleopatra. However, this isn't entirely a suicide in response to a rape by divine interference. This is also an act of cursing. Roman magical lore held, and this is pretty common for the Mediterranean, that you can create a curse by binding in life force to a prayer, either through an animal sacrifice of some kind or a sacrifice of your own blood. Dido, in sacrificing her own life, in a death that's very reminiscent of Mark Antony's death, interestingly, she falls on her sword and doesn't immediately die. She tries to get up 3 times before she just finally can't hold on any longer. Juno sends her messenger Iris to mercifully sever Dido's soul from her body so she can finally die. But with that moment, Dido lays a curse on Aeneas's descendants that curses the Punic Wars. So this entire incident becomes a mythological explanation for the Punic Wars, which took a huge amount of Roman life. And keep in mind, whose fault is it? Like, Dido doesn't invite Aeneas to crash on her shore. She takes him in as a refugee. She listens to the gods when they tell her to take him into her family. She tries to build a life with him. He jilts her. He ruins her political authority and creates a situation where she has to make a very difficult decision about whether or not to end her life. She decides to do so, but in doing so, she takes the last vengeance open to her. This, in essence, kind of blames Rome's founder for the Punic Wars. That's a very interesting choice on Virgil's part. Everything that goes on here is easily, I think, read as a political critique of civil war in general and Augustus's family in particular. One that is subtle, right? Virgil has some deniability, like he's just writing the story of Dido, and Carthage is the villain. Yeah, because Juno's the villain. But then in Dido's poem, Aeneas is the villain. And if that's not the most authentic Civil War experience for a poem, I don't know what is. In a civil war, you are your own villain. Your country divides against itself. Family turns on family. And that's part of what makes civil wars so messy and so traumatic. It's lovely and clever, and I'm very fond of it. Oh yes, I mentioned this. I'm not going to unpack this anymore, but just keep in mind, Dido has a backstory that's a lot like Aeneas's backstory. Only she's a lot more successful. So there's that. There's another moment I want to address here, and that's in the sea storm that sends Aeneas barreling into Dido's shore. Juno has to negotiate with Iolaus in order to get him to let the winds out of the wind cave and blow Aeneas off course. And part of how she does this is by leveraging her position as wife of the king of the gods, and therefore kind of is superior to Iolaus and kind of not. Iolaus knows that he's not supposed to let the winds out, but a request from the king of the gods' spouse is difficult to refuse. This power dynamic replicates the kind of power dynamic you had in Augustus and Livia's marriage. That's kind of interesting. Yes, as I mentioned, Venus's plan to save Aeneas from Dido is pretty half-baked. Part of Aeneas's problem is that Venus, because she's in charge of a human experience that almost by its definition resists rational thought. Like, people who experience sexual attraction experience it often as this overwhelming urge, this very difficult to override force that also tempts you into doing things that are super socially unacceptable and also socially destructive. Sexual attraction tempts people to have sex with people they shouldn't be having sex with and to hurt people who expect fidelity from them. You know, it's not automatically or recognizably a force for good. either in the world of Roman religion or in the world of the Aeneid. And that's part of what Aeneas has to deal with, is that the god who's doing the most to help him is helpful in a way that's actually very not helpful. So some of Aeneas's decision-making here is a little bit out of his control, and it ends up hurting him terribly. And this is part of what Venus doesn't seem to realize, is that Venus's solution is actively harmful to Aeneas. And she never acknowledges it, she never talks to her son about this, and Aeneas, the character, feels it. There's this one point where Venus appears to him in disguise, and he only recognizes her when she's going away, and he's like, oh my gosh, why don't you just come out and say hi to me like a normal person? Why are you always in disguise? What the heck? I'm your kid. You're a weird mom. And that's part of Aeneas's pain. His active parent is dead. His other parent is absent and unhelpful, and creates for him this real conflict of pietas, in which even when he's trying really hard to do the right thing, he can't win. And this is something that must have been a very relatable feeling in the late Republic. Like, in a civil war, making decisions about pietas become infinitely more complicated. For reasons we've unpacked, so I'm not going to dwell. Yes, as I mentioned, Dido's betrayal and her sacrifice of herself is what we call an etiology, a myth that explains the origin story of something. In this case, it's an origin story for the Civil Wars. I think I've said what I want to say about that, so I'm just going to leave you with this slide to remind you that that's important.
But Aeneas, he's a bit clueless. He knows nothing about this. He assumes that he leaves Carthage and everything's hunky-dory. As he's sailing out, he looks back and he sees this smoke cloud in the distance rising from Carthage, and he's like, oh, I wonder what's up with that. Bless his heart. Oh, Aeneas. No time for that, though, because he's got to go on his next stop in his hero quest. In fact, everybody's next stop in a hero quest, more or less. That is, he has to go to the Underworld to make contact with his past and to make his peace with the Shades, and also to seek more specific information from the gods about his glorious destiny. You'd think by book 6 he'd have caught on to the pattern here, but ever hopeful, Aeneas continues to Kumai, where he makes contact with one of several famous oracles scattered across the Mediterranean at a shrine that's sacred to Apollo. Kumai itself is a town with a long Greek history before Rome expands and occupies. And the priestess at the shrine at Kumai was still active during Augustus's time and for many years afterwards. The mythological backstory to this is one that's repeated a lot in mythology. The god Apollo, you see, had a little trouble with his pickup technique. Let me explain. He likes to approach mortals and then make them some kind of a gift offer that isn't actually a gift, and then he asks them out for sex. And then generally they turn him down. And the ones that don't turn him down end up cheating on him. It's just not great, but then again, he's sort of manipulative. This particular one, he's walking along the shore with a woman named Sybil. Not the only woman named Sybil that Apollo tries to date, interestingly. He's got a type, I guess. So as they're walking along the shore, he says, gosh, you're hot. I really want you to be my girlfriend. In fact, I'll give you the gift of prophecy right now, and then you can ask for, like, anything. She's like, oh, anything? Like, and then she scoops up handfuls full of sand because they're on the beach. She says, "I'd like as many years of life as there are grains of sand in my hand." He's like, "Done! Awesome! Great! When are we gonna bang?" And she's like, "Well, actually, it's not you, it's me. I'm just not at a place in my life where I actually want to date a god. It's awkward. It never ends well for the mortals. Just, let's call it good and let's stay friends." And Apollo's like, "Oh my god, I can't believe this is happening again." For a prophecy god, he's very dense about pattern recognition. So he says, "Okay, look, I cannot take back my gifts once given, so you're stuck with the prophecy, and I promised you as many years as the grains of sand, so that's done. But I'm going to give you a bonus gift. Rather, I'm going to give you just what you asked for, not anything else." Because she asked for as many years of life as grains of sand, but she didn't ask for eternal youth. Keep this in mind. If a god ever asks you out, ask for eternal youth too. Many mortals make this mistake. It's really common, but it's not their fault. They don't have the internet. They can't compare notes. I didn't mean to sound judgy. So the Sibyl at Kumai's deal is that she's eternally aging and can never die. And also she has a gift of prophecy. And in this situation, these women end up being bound for life to Apollo. In recorded history, this means that they have a renewable priestessship that passes from person to person. Many of these priestesses were deliberately chosen among postmenopausal women. For instance, the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi, the Pythia, was chosen from among women 40 years and older. So among the many things that Hollywood gets wrong, the priestesses are usually a wee bit too nubile. The Cumaean Sibyl lives in a specific location we're going to look at in a minute. So Aeneas meets her when she's already very old, and she's unmarried, because one of the deals that you take when you're Apollo's priestess is if he can't have you, nobody can, so you just stay unpartnered in your shrine forever. Now, interestingly, this didn't mean that the priestess of Apollo had never had sex. Virginity is a construct, and it's a construct that works a little bit differently in the ancient world. They didn't believe that virginity was something you lose and never get back, necessarily. Virginity rather was a state of non-sexual activity that you could move into and out of at various stages of your life. It was often used as a shorthand for an unmarried woman or a young teenage woman, but it's also used for women who are no longer sexually active, either because their partner's dead or they're just not interested anymore. All kinds of reasons anybody doesn't have sex. Uh, it's almost always a femme-specific term. There are, however, men in mythology who meet it. Hippolytus, for instance, very likely an early instance of asexual representation. Alas, not a happy one, and also not this story. At any rate, the priestesses of Apollo would undergo a ritual cleansing, then they would enter into their office of priestess. Depending on the local rules, this could be anything from you'd have regular cleansing sessions and you might go home to your family for a while or not. In other instances, you had your cleansing ritual and then you lived at the shrine, and that was your job now, was to be the oracle of the god. At any rate, the Sibyl Aeneas meets is the mythological OG Sibyl, and there she is in an ancient fresco, being awesome, standing outside of her shrine. And the reason you go to her is that she's got this direct line to the gods. And by now, Aeneas is being careful. He's learned a trick or two. He realizes that the gods are not being very careful about their communication process, and he wants to make sure that this time he gets some decent information. Also, he misses his dad, and his dad's in the underworld, so he's gonna go visit. On to the archaeological site of Kumai. So here we are looking at the hill of Kumai from a distance, and you can see the remains of some of the ancient temples, some of the later buildings, and then the natural outcropping of the mountain itself. You are looking at the shrine. The shrine is cut into the side of the mountain. It's a cave complex, and Virgil describes it as such. The fresco on the last slide looked a lot like a shrine, but likely that was an original shrine front facade that was built onto the mountain. Now here we are looking into the cave complex at one of the entrances. This is a very old way of building a cave into an unstable surface. Now, this has been cut into the rock. It's tufa, which is a volcanic stone that is soft when you're cutting into it, but it hardens in the presence of air. So it dries effectively into a very tough, resilient material. The fact that we're looking at it right now in an earthquake-prone region 2,000 years later should tell you something. It's actually older than that. It's more like 3,000 years, this thing. But this kind of arch type was developed before the invention of round arch frames with keystones, where you would build each layer of stone a little bit closer to the middle and a little bit closer until they finally meet at the top. So when people went to delve archways into the stone, they'd replicate the kind of structure that distributed weight well elsewhere, which is what's up with the shape. But this meant that in later years, this was a throwback. It had this feeling of deep, deep ancientness. And the fact that it goes into the mountainside and spirals around into this complex, and also sits near the Bay of Naples, which is the very rim of a supervolcano. So Mount Vesuvius, you're probably familiar with. Mount Vesuvius is one cone of a volcano that erupts fairly regularly, about every 500 years or so, just infrequently enough that people forget it's a volcano, except eventually we invented writing, and that helped a little bit. People still live there, though. It's a situation that's waiting to devolve. Probably not soon, though. It last erupted in 1945, I think. But it wasn't a particularly massive one, so we might get an even bigger one soonish. We'll see. But Vesuvius is just part of a larger supervolcano. The Bay of Naples itself is the edge of that crater. And that's why Vesuvius is so gosh darn volatile, is that it's part of a much larger, much deeper plume. And that erupts much less frequently, but should it ever go off, it would be just disastrous. However, what this means for the Aeneid, and for this setting in particular, is that Kumai sits over a plain of sulfuric, volcanically active fields that are heated from below the ground and give off steam constantly. There are lakes that regularly belch out gases that kill everything around. Birds flying through the air will die on the wing and plop into the lake. This led ancient people in Italy to believe that this was an entrance to the underworld. And that's why Aeneas is here. So he has to go to the Sibyl to figure out how to successfully and safely enter the underworld, because the underworld is protected in many ways to keep living people from going down there, which is why heroes do it, right? You tell a hero, hey, you can't do this thing, mortals shouldn't go there, and they're like, awesome, where's my map? This is what Aeneas is up to. So some of this he does because this is what heroes in the ancient world do, but he's got more than enough reason to go. This also gives Virgil some great scope for his modern political goals, modern to him, is that the underworld for Virgil contains not only the souls of the dead, but also the souls of the future living. So while Aeneas is down there, he gets to come as close as he ever gets to seeing the glorious futures of his descendants. It's at the very middle of the epic. It's meant to be a high point. It's this feel-good, rah-rah, yay, Rome, awesome moment. The highlight of it is when they see like the star rising of divine Julius, and they get this prophecy that Rome will conquer the entire world and it's going to be awesome and amazing. Rome didn't actually conquer the whole world, just, the greater Mediterranean region. Kudos if you're into that kind of thing. Here's further inside the Cave of the Sibyl, which has a lot of intersecting chambers and antechambers. I've given you part of the floor plan so you can see what I mean by this. Along the front corridor are windows opening into the daylight, and that's what we're looking down on the left here. You can see the hallway curving a bit and the shafts of light coming in from the windows opening to the day. These shafts of light penetrate deeper into the caves, so you can kind of see, but the further back you get, the darker it gets. And the wind whistling past the cliff face creates this howling noise as it flutes over the openings of the windows. I've been there. It is so eerie in the best possible sense. It's one of these otherworldly, numinous places that just feels nifty, even though the decoration that would have been there in Virgil's day is gone. See, it's looking a little battered and worse for wear, but it's still doing what it's meant to do, which is to be slightly creepy and otherworldly and awesome. Now, the Sibyl is Aeneas's guide into the underworld, and here we're going to move a little bit away from our immediate historical context to talk a bit about the Underworld's Map, because this is one of the most detailed underworld maps to come out of the ancient world, and one of the most influential as well. This is the one that inspires Dante's Inferno, which is fan fiction of fan fiction of fan fiction, which pleases me greatly because I rather enjoy fan fiction. So if you're familiar with any kind of Europe adjacent geography of the land of the dead, you're likely to come on some kind of a new take on Virgil's Underworld. This is an attempt to map it, and this is from reasonably precise descriptions in Book 6. Aeneas's path takes him down past an elm tree. Our map maker has tried to superimpose Odysseus's journey to the underworld on top of this. That's questionable, but I don't need to get into Odysseus now. This isn't his epic. He needs to stay in his lane. The major dividing point between the world of the living and the world of the dead is this river complex, this very marshy network of rivers that includes the Styx. The Styx comes from a Greek word meaning the hateful or the hated river. The idea is that this is a river that if you're alive and you go near it, your very being is supposed to recoil from it. You can't stand it, but also even the gods fear it a bit. When the gods swear to you an unbreakable oath, and I hope that this is useful to you if the gods ever try to make a deal with you, if they swear on the river Styx, they have to do the thing they said they were going to do, even if they really don't want to. Just be careful that you actually want what you ask if you make them swear by the river Styx. Honestly, I'd stay away from the Greek and Roman gods. They're kind of douche lords. Except for Hephaestus, Vulcan. He's nifty. He's okay. And like, Hades, better than advertised. And Dionysus gets a bad rap, but he's pretty fantastic. And weirdly enough, Eros is the least rapey. Maybe Dionysus too, but definitely Eros. Okay, back to the rivers. The Acheron is the river of wailing, the river of grief. The Phlegethon is the river of fire, because it's a river made of fire. Sorry, that's a bit anticlimactic, isn't it? When Aeneas approaches the shore, all of these shades rush up to the river Styx to get a ride from Charon or Charon, the god who runs the ferry boat that takes you across the Styx. You have to have payment, and you have to have some kind of a proof that you've had a funeral. If you don't get a funeral, at least in the mythological world, then you don't get to cross the river Styx. Virgil, however, gives you a bit of an out. He says after 100 years, Charon will finally let you go. But to get across in a timely fashion, you need to have payment and a funeral. And one of Aeneas's companions meets him there, and Aeneas is like, dude, I didn't realize you were dead. And he's like, yeah, man, I totally died. I was on watch one night, and I fell off the boat, and then I got into this seashell blowing contest. It's very complicated. You don't need to remember the details of this. So Aeneas realizes that, oh, okay, I have to bury my bro later when I get out of here. And he does. It's a happy ending, one of the few that we get in this story. Once Aeneas has crossed the river, and he's only able to do it because the Sibyl vouches for him, and he brings this golden branch. It might be a mistletoe plant, but it's not clear from the poem. Then he has to pass the very good boy of the underworld, Cerberus, the three-headed doom dog. This is, of course, Fluffy's ancestor, for those of you who are familiar with Harry Potter. And if you aren't, he's just the three-headed dog of the underworld. There is no three-headed god of the underworld. There's a three-headed dog. Oh dear. The Asphodel Fields is the point at which you get sorted into your houses of Hades. You see what I did there? Yeah, that was weak. Just humor me. It's been a long pandemic. At this point, you're judged by three kings of the underworld, including King Minos for some reason. But there's also this intermediate area where people go who have had an irregular death, including people who have taken their own life. And this makes for one of my favorite moments in the Aeneid. So Aeneas crosses and he bumps into Dido, and he's like, oh my god, you're dead? You're dead and you're in the suicide section? Well, it's for suicide and murder. And Aeneas is like, oh my god, I didn't realize you'd take it like that. Like, I didn't dump you because I wanted to. Like, the gods made me. I swear, I totally didn't mean to do anything. And she could have told him that impact is not the same as intent, but instead she just stares at him for a moment and then turns her back on him, walks away, and goes and takes the hand of her murdered husband. And then they go off to be together for all eternity, which is awesome. And it kind of makes me a little teary because I'm a huge goofy goober about this kind of thing. But also, gosh darn it, Dido kind of gets a happy ending, sort of. I mean, she's dead, and the fields of Asphodel are kind of boring, but she's there with her murdered spouse, and he's staying with her. And he understands, and he sees Aeneas, he notices he's there, but he's totally cool with her and supportive. And my gosh, if that's not relationship goals, actually no, that's a very bad relationship goal, but relationship plan Bs, that's okay. It's a good spouse. His name's Zacchaeus, by the way, Dido's spouse. Aeneas, anyway, kind of shrugs it off and continues on. Virgil says he feels really, really upset, but he's just got to go. He passes Tartarus, which is where the very, very bad people go. By very, very bad people, we don't mean people who have done horrible war crimes to each other in life. We mean people who have cheesed off the gods. Very different standard for what constitutes bad in this world. There's eternal torment. mostly in terms of psychologically damaging slash boring eternities, like pushing a rock up a hill for the rest of your life, or being stuck on a wheel that just turns all the time. Very unpleasant kind of place. Then, through the Palace of Hades, Aeneas continues on to Elysium, which is this really nice area of the underworld. This is the place you want to go. This is the place where heroes go, although not necessarily the place where heroes in the sense of good people go. The bar for heroism isn't behaving well, even in Virgil, who's trying to make morality a criterion for his hero. Nonetheless, the people that Aeneas runs into there include, I think he runs into Hector at one point, and there's also this awkward confrontation with a guy whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, one of Hector's brothers. And then finally, he runs into his dad, who then shows him all of the souls of future Romans. Because, and here's the plot twist, this is new and interesting and different. It's not clear if Virgil invented this theological concept, but it's kind of nifty it's showing up here. There's another river called the Leafy. Here it's spelled a little bit differently. This is an alternative. Usually it's Lethe. But the Leafy River is the river of forgetfulness, and when you drink from it, you forget your first life, and then you return to the land of the living to go have another life, which is an interesting twist, isn't it? And awfully similar to the kind of theology Caesar was accusing Druids of having. If you enjoy theological nerdery as I do, that's a telling moment. So Aeneas sees his future, he sees his dad, he has this wonderful reunion, but he can't stay, he has to go. And here's where something kind of interesting happens. There are these two gates, one of horn and one of ivory. One is the door through which dreams exit, and the other is the door through which prophecy exits, truth. Aeneas goes through the door of dreams, which is an enigmatic moment. We're not sure what Virgil was going for there, but this doesn't stop people from publishing papers about it. Nevertheless, this is as good as it gets for Aeneas, is seeing all of his dead friends and looking into the future of Rome. He's given some really good pep talks here, and he's going to need them because we're only halfway through this epic and we're about to get to the war part. The first half was not the war part, interestingly, although Troy gets burned and Aeneas is a refugee for most of it. Oh no, it gets bad again. Because when Aeneas lands in Italy, people are already there. Not just people, but Greek people. Lots of Greek people, Etruscan people, Latin people, because, like any other imperialist with dreams of colonialism, he's got to fight for his real estate. By comparison, Dido does this in a pretty classy way. She makes a deal with the locals. There's a little bit of trickery involved, but essentially she comes to a peaceful negotiation for the land for Carthage. Aeneas tries to do this, and some of the gods do help him by sending a dream to King Latinus, who is the king of the Latins, hence the name Latinus. You see there's a theme there. He has a daughter named Lavinia who was engaged to a local dude named Turnus. However, the gods tell him that Lavinia is destined for a foreign husband, so Latinus breaks the engagement. Aeneas shows up. He's like, oh, awesome, you must be the foreign guy. Great, you can marry my daughter. And it seems like that's gonna be it. Aeneas's engagement is ratified. Turnus is cheesed off, but he's essentially trying to make his peace with it. He'd realizes that Latinus gets to say who Lavinia marries. But Juno is having none of this. She's not managed to drown Aeneas at sea, so now it's her last-ditch attempt. So she sends one of the Furies. These are these primordial goddesses of the underworld, whose entire job is to haunt people and give them horrible, blood-curdling, nightmarish visions and essentially psychotic episodes until their minds break and they're utterly destroyed. So, this happy character wings her way into Italy, where she begins to stir up resentment against Aeneas. And it's pretty easy to do. All she has to do really is say to Lavinia's mom, hey, are you cool with your daughter marrying a foreigner? Because, like, I don't remember them asking you. And also, like, do you know him? Do you know if he's okay? Is he going to be a jerk? Like, you should totally get in the middle of this. Then she goes to Turnus and she says, Turnus, you let another guy steal your woman? What the heck is up with that? And then at first, to his credit, Turnus is like, oh my gosh, this is so ridiculous. I'm not going to war for this nonsense. You're just overreacting and trying to get me worked up. And then the Fury basically like takes one of the snakes out of her outfit. Furies wear snakes. That's what they do. Or sorry, no, it's not a snake, it's a torch. She takes this burning torch of anger and she physically shoves it into Turnus's chest. And then with this divinely inspired rage fire burning in his heart, he then effectively has his will overridden. The gods have to break his agency and override his consent in order to get him to start into this war. But we're not done yet. It's not enough that we have to like get humans involved. We also have to mess with someone's pet. So there's this family that has a pet deer that a little girl raised. It's her pet. They love the deer loves them. It's this tame deer. And then Ascanius, Julius, is out in the woods hunting, and then the deer is prodded into his way. Ascanius shoots the deer, and then when they notice that their pet deer has been killed by Aeneas's son, that's it. That's the breaking point. The Latins and the Rutulians, Turnus's people, or the Rutulians, are like, you know, screw this. These foreigners show up, they're taking our women, they're trying to take over the kingdom of Latinus, because that's what Aeneas is going to get. He marries the king's daughter and he gets to be the new king. And they're like, no, that's not how this works. You don't come to our land and then like take over by marrying the king's daughter. That's unacceptable. And also, they killed our pet. I find that the most relatable motive myself. So the Latins go to war. Lavinia's mother has a psychotic break and runs off into the woods. Latinus is unable to cope. He turns away from the situation, and Aeneas is left scrambling to find allies as Turnus rallies the people of Italy to resist Aeneas's encroachment. What we now have is a reversal of the narrative in Book 1, where Aeneas is the victim of an invasion. The Greeks come to Troy, lay siege to it, capture it, burn it, liquidate the people, enslave the women, kill some of the children, kill the men, and Aeneas and his people narrowly escape that, right? So they know what it feels like to be invaded. And as refugees, they come to Italy, and then they suddenly they actively choose to go with this when the locals start an armed resistance trying to drive them out of Italy. Aeneas, convinced that the gods are on his side, they're going to back him, that he needs to do this, raises his own army, and he has become what he was fleeing in the first place. Aeneas and his men become an invading army, marching into someone else's land and attempting to take it by force. It's a weird space to be in, and this is not the start of Aeneas breaking, but it's a really important factor in why he changes over the next few books. Now, in his search for allies, Aeneas ends up in the site of future Rome, the Palatine region on the edge of the Tiber. And it's not like a proper city, but people live there. And in charge in this area is a guy named Evander who has a son, Pallas. Evander and Aeneas bond, and Evander lets Pallas march with Aeneas. So Pallas is going to learn the art of being a good man from Aeneas. Aeneas is going to teach him how to fight, how to strategize, how to command, and Aeneas really bonds with this kid. He treats him like a second son, but this relationship is predicated on Aeneas teaching Pallas to take up arms and enter into conflict. And that is the problem here. But it's a relatable problem for first century Romans, because that's what they've been told manliness is. A proper man in this society goes to war. They're mentored by older men who show them how to fight. They get them to engage in the necessary emotional labor of going to war, to take lives, to pillage cities, to do all of the things you have to do if you're in an ancient war. But in that process, you're combining two things that together create immense personal damage to the people engaging in them. You're creating bonds across generations. Older people are mentoring younger people. They're encouraging them to embark on a life of violence and a life of conquest, and a life where the people who are doing a lot of the first contact with the enemy are the younger people. Even with the cohort system, which tended to break up the kinds of age categorization you got with the three-part formation of the Manipular Legion. Like Maniples literally put the youngest people in the front and they get killed first. Cohorts don't necessarily do that in as direct a way, but even so, the less experienced you are, the more likely you are to die quickly, and the more psychological damage this causes, because one of the horrors of war, and something that Virgil leans into heavily when he's trying to make this argument that war is counterproductive and civil war is especially toxic, is this idea that children die before their fathers do, and that a father, the male head of household who's supposed to love and protect and nurture the next generation, has to watch as that younger generation dies and leaves them alone without a family to run anymore. This would have been super relatable to everybody involved in the Civil War. Nobody who read Virgil in the first generation would read it without some direct experience of either themselves or a relative losing a child as a part of civil war. And while, this kind of isn't a civil war, it is a war of aggression and invasion, but it also is kind of a civil war, because Aeneas is the ancestor of the Romans, but so is Turnus. This is a bit of a spoiler, but it's an important spoiler. Eventually, local Latins combine with Aeneas's people, and they form this hybrid race that is the Romans. But this means that the minute Romans, even in their proto-mythological form, the minute they're setting foot on Italian soil almost, they're getting involved in a civil war. Even pre-Romulus, civil war is a theme. And this is one of the ways that Virgil is grappling with and processing his very recent experience. Sadly, this is going to be the experience of another generation of Romans in a few decades. Now, I did mention there's a bit of a spoiler here. Pallas does not survive this war. Pallas, Aeneas's protege, the son of the man who's king of the area that eventually becomes Rome, goes out to fight against Turnus, and Turnus kills him. Here, Aeneas is faced with a dilemma. When he was in the underworld, his father's ghost, that is, gives him a lot of advice, but one of the big things he's told is that the way that you should proceed, the way you should go ahead, is pagere subjectis debellare superbos, which translates rather loosely as you should spare the conquered and beat the crap out of the proud. This isn't a new idea or a new moral norm. This is part of the Aeneid, part of the Iliad, part of the Odyssey. In the epic tradition, if an enemy surrenders to you and begs for their life, or at least the return of their body to their relatives, you're supposed to consider and ideally honor that. When you don't, when you kill that person anyway, that's a bit of a line to cross, and that's a sign that a hero is losing stability. It happens with Achilles, it happens with a lot of people, and it's about to happen to Aeneas, because Turnus and Aeneas eventually face off in Book 12. They almost face off a few times in the books leading up to this, but Pallas is dead. Aeneas is out of his mind with grief, with rage, with anger, and he can see nothing else, not even his own destiny, right, except for Turnus. He wants to kill Turnus, and he wants to do it not because the gods told him to, and not because he wants a future for Rome. And in some ways, he seems to have lost track of why he's there and what he's doing. He wants nothing else but to just kill Turnus, because Turnus killed Pallas, and Aeneas has lost one person too many. And keep in mind, he lost his not entire, but most of his community at Troy and his wife. He's lost his father. He lost a lot of his people in the process of moving from Troy to eventually Italy. He's lost Dido. He's lost his home in Carthage. And when it looked like he was about to finally get what the gods had promised him, boom, he has to fight a civil war. It's a very, very bad few years to be Aeneas. So at this final moment, Turnus and Aeneas fight, and the gods make a deal in Olympus. Jupiter says to Juno, okay, look, you know that Aeneas is fated to found a race that's going to have this great destiny. And she's like, yeah, I know, I get it. And, obviously you're not letting me go down there and interfere anymore, so I guess I've lost or whatever. But you know what? It's really unfair that I have to sit here and watch the Trojan name be perpetuated. And Jupiter's like, okay, look, Juno, we have to come to some arrangement. We have to make a compromise. What is it that will satisfy you and satisfy fate? Which is an interesting point that a lot of people miss. Juno doesn't exactly lose. She wins bargaining power, and that's her achievement. And when she has this moment, she uses it to ask for the following. She says, okay, let Aeneas give his blood to the future Roman people, but that's it. Let the name of Troy die with Aeneas. Let his people be enfolded into the Latins. Let them speak the Latin language. Let them keep Latin customs. Let them live like Latins. Don't erase the Latin culture. Don't erase Latin folkways. Don't erase anything about the people that you've sent Aeneas into like a wrecking ball here. And Jupiter's like, okay, cool, that's an acceptable compromise. It's a neat compromise, though, because it acknowledges the right of a local people to maintain their identity in the context of the social wars. That's big. And the social wars were only less than a century ago for Virgil. There's not a lot of people alive who were alive during the social wars, but it hasn't been that long either. And this is something that's going to be really meaningful. that Virgil is acknowledging that the Trojans, although they're part of the story of Rome, they're largely erased. The language, the customs, the clothing, all of that, native Italian. And it's Aeneas who had to assimilate to Italy and not the other way around, which is nifty and important. But on the ground, what this ends up being for Turnus is a betrayal, because in order to get this for the future of Turnus's people, Juno has to give up trying to save Turnus. Turnus, remember, whom she had manipulated into contesting Aeneas's claim in the first place. Yet again, Juno gets somebody into a situation and then kind of abandons them when she's gotten what she wants. And that should trouble you, as it should trouble an ancient audience, because this is the price of pietas. Honoring the gods means not understanding what they're doing and getting an answer that sacrifices you for the sake of a predestined future. This is an immense blow against your individual happiness, your individual safety, your identity, all of this. And that's the dark side of what's going on here, is that Virgil is creating a model for the erasure of people who are being enfolded into the Roman world of his time. So remember, civil war doesn't slow Roman imperialism all that much. If anything, it speeds it up a bit in the 1st century BCE. And this normalizes assimilation, because Romans can now say, oh, well, we were Trojan, but we assimilated, so you guys too should assimilate. Like, why are you whining? You get to be Romans. Everybody wants to be Romans. Romans are awesome. And it's an explanation that worked pretty well. Europe's participation in the Stockholm Syndrome arising from Roman conquest is impressively persistent. It's long outlasted the existence of Rome as a coherent empire, inter alia. Turnus is tricked into facing Aeneas, and then as he's going up, he realizes he has to fight, he's cornered. He picks up a rock to throw, and then Virgil tells us that in a moment that's like a dream, like when you're dreaming and you try to do something that you know you can do outside of a dream, but your limbs are numb, the strength leaves you, you just can't, you run but you're not getting anywhere. I don't know if you guys have this happen to you in dreams, but I find this very relatable. It's a bit of a recurring nightmare I have, so it's nifty to find it in Virgil, and sad. So Turnus is in this waking nightmare where he throws the stone, but the gods have left him. He can't put the force behind it. It falls short of Aeneas, and then Aeneas throws his spear at Turnus, and Turnus is hit through the thigh. He crumbles to the ground on his knees, defenseless, and Aeneas comes up to him. At this point, the following scene. Alright guys, indulge me. This is my favorite part of one of my favorite poems, and I'm going to read it in Latin. It's not long. Indulge me. Fureis accensus et ira terribilis, tuninc spoileis indutem eorum, reperare mihi, pallas toc vonera pallas, immolat et poenam scelerat ex sanguine sumit. Hoc decanes, ferad verso su pectore condit, fervidus, ast illi sovuntur frigore membra, vitaque cum gemetum fugit indignata subumberas. Inflamed by his rage, and terrible in his anger, Aeneas said, are you, the man wearing the spoils of my men, to be ripped out of my clutches? Pallas slays you with this wound. Pallas sacrifices you and exacts his revenge from your criminal blood. Saying this, he plunged his sword deep into the chest in front of him, boiling over with rage. But Turnus's limbs were loosened by chill, and his life, with a groan, fled indignata below the shadows. I've left indignata untranslated because it has a double meaning. It means both unfairly taken, unworthily victimized, unfairly, but it also means unworthy. Both meanings exist in the same space here in tension. And that's part of what's sad about Turnus. Turnus is unworthy because the gods designated him so, but he's also indignata in the sense of undeserving. He's undeserving of what happens to him here. He's surrendered. He's allowed Aeneas to have Lavinia. He's given Aeneas everything he wants. He agrees to cooperate. And also, he was tricked into this conflict in large respect. He resists, and his consent was taken away from him, and his anger was urged on by the gods. He entered into this conflict, partly out of spite, but also in the heat of the moment, driven by understandable and righteous rage. In some ways, the gods do side with his cause, because they choose Latin identity over Trojan identity. But also, we need to look at what's happened to Aeneas. So this is Aeneas who calmly comforted his men after a shipwreck, Aeneas who's kept his cool through the underworld, Aeneas who's been patient, Aeneas whose governing quality in this poem has been pietas, yeah? And it's not that he's not showing pietas here. He's angry because a young man that he took responsibility for, he promised this young man's pater familias that he would be like a second pater familias. He would look after him, he'd take care of him, he'd teach him how to be a man, and he'd return him covered in glory. But what did he actually do? He took him into a war zone, he put a sword in his hand, he told him that Turnus was evil and that it was glorious to fight, and Pallas was a really good student. He took Aeneas's lessons, he went up against Turnus, and he died. Turnus put the sword in Pallas, but Aeneas put Pallas's sword in Pallas's hand. Now, Turnus did take Pallas's belt off of him, which is what Aeneas is looking at when he has this snap moment. Aeneas is about to spare Turnus, and then he sees that Turnus is wearing a belt that used to be owned by Pallas. It's perfectly acceptable to take spoils of war in epic combat. People do it all the time. That's not what Aeneas is thinking, though. Aeneas isn't thinking, oh yes, that's allowed under the terms and conditions of epic warfare, and therefore it is acceptable. Now, he looks, and he's reminded, you killed a kid I loved. A member of the younger generation is dead because of you. And he's not thinking about Rome, he's not thinking about the gods, he's not thinking about glory, and in some way he's not even thinking about his duty to Pallas. He's not thinking at all. He's enraged. He's snapping. And yeah, he manages to put together a very coherent speech because it's epic. Everybody's coherent and epic. Mostly. There are a couple instances where not, but it's for art reasons. His objection, though, is very revealing, right? The first thing he says, you're wearing the spoils of my men, and you're going to get away from me? Oh, no. He makes it personal. He makes it about him. And you know what? It is personal. It is personal when people you love die in war, and it requires way too much cognitive dissonance to think otherwise. Because we're human, gosh darn it. Like Aeneas is human. Aeneas is a person who has been jerked around since the beginning of this poem by his desperate attempts to do what conflicting gods are telling him to do, and to work for an unclear future for his family that he himself will never see or experience. He is angry, he is bitter, and he is absolutely broken by the trauma he's experienced over the course of this epic. And when he says that he's not doing this, that Pallas is doing this, I'm just letting Pallas use my arm to get revenge on you, he's perpetuating a cycle of violence. In this moment, Aeneas, over making peace and coming to an accord and actively participating in his own assimilation too, he's choosing instead violence and death. And that's the end of the poem. This is the last line of the poem. It ends with Turnus's shade slipping down to the shadows, and the story ends in shadows. We know from other traditions of early myth, Aeneas dies shortly afterwards. He doesn't live to see his son found Alba Longa. He certainly never gets to see Rome. He himself is this obscure hero. He gets a bit of a second life with Virgil. Virgil makes him popular again. In essence, though, I think in this moment, Aeneas realizes that his choice, such as it was a choice, some of it's personality, some of it is just like family circumstances. When you're a god's kid, your relationship to Pietas is something you're not going to escape very well, because the gods show up and yell at you whenever you screw it up, because they're your family also. He realizes, though, that he was asked to do things that he doesn't benefit from, that has broken his heart and broken his spirit, that's asked sacrifices of him that has eventually cost him his humanity. I'm not sure if he totally realizes this here, but we, as the audience, can see it. He's lost his ability to give mercy. He, for the first time almost, breaks with advice given to him by his father. He's supposed to fight to the end, to beat the crap out of people who are proud, people who are rebelling. But Turnus isn't rebelling. He's the defeated, and he's begging for mercy. Aeneas disobeys his father, and that's the end of the poem. This is cool, and I love it, because this is a moment where I think Virgil most clearly articulates the rage and the conflicted emotions of his generation. This sense of futility, this sense of having been manipulated, this sense of being lied to by your culture's expectations, by your society's demands, the feeling of having been bullied into a model of masculinity that asks way too much out of you as a human being, and that eventually takes your soul with it. That violence robs you of a part of yourself and leaves you angry and bereft, because at the end of this, Turnus is dead, but Pallas is dead. Pallas is dead, Aeneas' friends are dead, his first wife is dead. His victory is hollow and sad, and part of me wonders if, when Augustus read the manuscript of this poem after Virgil's death, knowing that Virgil had asked him to burn it, what Augustus saw in this moment was something that he related to. Because I've talked a lot of shit about Augustus, yes? But Augustus, he's also a person. And I'm going to assume, for the sake of argument here, that Augustus is not a complete sociopath. That Augustus loves, Augustus mourns, Augustus feels conflict over the horrible things he's done in the name of his own power. Surely part of Augustus believes what he's saying in the Res Gestae. He has to justify that to himself somehow. But you cannot be as effective a politician as Augustus was in keeping power for that long when you come to it under such circumstances as he did. Julius Caesar couldn't do that. Augustus manages it. I think he had to have enough self-awareness to have moments where he wondered, gosh, what's been the cost? Eventually, Augustus is going to find that his rhetoric advocating for an aggressive expansionistic agenda ends up costing Roman lives at the Teutoburger Forest. He's going to lose his daughter over this. His legislative agenda puts him in direct conflict with his own child, and eventually he has to exile her. According to ancient sources, this broke his heart. He still did it. It didn't stop him, but he, to all reports, was devastated. He loved her very much. Although I'm going to be careful, because love doesn't mean you exile your kid. That's a really shitty way to parent. So I'm not suggesting that that's good parenting. I'm just saying he was damaged by the consequences of his own choices. And eventually he did sacrifice not just his daughter to empire, but one after another, his adopted sons died off one way or another. One of them died as part of service abroad. I think that's Lucius, his daughter Julia's middle son. The youngest is exiled, the older one dies of apparently natural causes. Before that, his nephew Marcellus dies suddenly. When Tiberius inherits, he inherits in part because he's the last thing close enough to a relative to inherit from Augustus. He's Augustus's stepson. He's Livia's son from a previous marriage. I wonder if Augustus, he would have gotten his draft of Aeneid in 19 BCE. I mean, he's still mid-career. He has another 15 years or so left to rule. But I wonder if he sat with it and recognized himself in Aeneas and thought, this is a good epic for promoting my agenda, but also I feel seen. I feel humanized. The part of me that wants to hope in human nature leans into that feeling. There's no way we can tell. It's an unrecoverable question. But it's part of why I'm so deeply in love with this epic, is this very sense of heartbroken internal conflict that it leaves you with. What a great way to memorialize civil war, because that's what it does. It breaks your heart and destroys the people you love, and any victory is a hollow one where you triumph over the bodies of people you love. Moving away from that, we need to talk a little bit about why we're still reading the Aeneid. Because just because something is a really good document of its time doesn't mean it's going to stick around. This became a Roman national epic, partly because of the subject matter, partly because it's just very good, really well written. But also, it made a great school text. When people learned to read, they'd learn to read from Virgil. It was a great way to learn Latin as a second language. We still use it as one of the first texts we give you when you learn Latin. It's interesting, it's engaging, it's really beautifully written, and it demonstrates everything that the Latin language does so well that translation doesn't really capture. I don't like any really translations of the Aeneid because it never gets to where the Latin goes. But that only works so long as Latin is a living language, which it is for longer than you might think. It's still being spoken as an international language of science in Isaac Newton's day. So well into the 1600s, much longer than there's a Roman Empire. Virgil because he's such a foundational text, and because he contains themes that later fit better than other Roman poets' themes into a new Christian majority and eventually a Christiano-normative Roman Empire, becomes essentially grandfathered in. Some people refer to him as the pagan prophet. And by some people, I mean like Christians in the late antique and medieval period. There were fan theories that tried to view some of Virgil's poetry as predicting the coming of Jesus. That's not what it was about, but they were just so desperate to make it okay to love Virgil because he was just that compelling, and they didn't want to not be able to read Virgil. This meant that Virgil continued to be a text copied and recopied and circulated really everywhere in the Middle Ages. Not just in the Christian world either. Versions circulate in the Arabic tradition too. But where Virgil is most obvious as an influence is in Dante's Inferno. Oh, I should also mention there are two ways of spelling his name. Vergil, Vergil with an E, is closer to the way he spelled his name, but in the Middle Ages they started spelling it with an I because it looked like the virga was a teacher's rod that they used to smack your hands to exert their authority on the classroom. And since Virgil was kind of like the ultimate schoolmaster textbook god, making a pun with his name, he's like the authoritative Virgil. That's why there are two spellings. The Virgil is a fan spelling. Vergil with an E, I prefer. But really, if you're not saying Virgilius, you're not saying his name in a format he'd recognize. Yes, so Dante's Inferno is a pretty obvious connection here. Dante is essentially, when he writes his description of hell, leaning heavily into Virgil. He's taking a lot of it just wholesale. And at one point, he meets up with Virgil, and Virgil gives him a guided tour of Hades, which is just the most fan fiction-y thing to ever happen, is when Dante's favorite author, Virgil, shows up and takes him on a tour. And then they have this conversation, and they're best friends. Dante's Inferno is one of the best loved and most critically acclaimed pieces of self-insert fanfic that exists ever. Dante also takes this woman whom he stalked in real life, Beatrice, and writes her into the epic as well. Oh, Dante, so creepy, so problematic. Speaking of creepy and problematic, Virgil becomes a central text of fascism in the 1940s, and he's also a central text in Italian nationalistic movements prior to fascism. Now, I've made a really good case for Virgil as a pro-peace anti-fascist text. I haven't leaned too heavily into Virgil as a drumbeater for expansion and a cheerleader for imperialism and order and authority, partly because that's the easy reading of Virgil. If you're reading him uncritically and you're taking it as granted that all of the characters are meant to be admirable characters that we accept without question and whose actions are beyond reproach, if you read Virgil that way, then the ultimate conclusion is that you are supposed to be like Aeneas, namely an imperialist who believes in total devotion to the state and the gods, and in subsuming family interests to this state identity, which you can do. Lots of people have. It was a very trendy reading right on into the 60s. In the wake of World War II, and with the rise of anti-war and anti-nuclear war activism, came a new a kind of new, not really a new trend, because this is cyclical. It seems that the fashion for Virgil goes from fascist rah-rah to Virgil the contrarian beatnik PC hippie dude, and then back again. It swings because Virgil's complicated. You can use him to argue for both depending on what you want to do. Uh, the reading I lean towards is heavily influenced by this reading, and in all honesty, I have to say that part of that is because I was trained in the late 20th century. I'm a 21st century scholar, and that was the newfangled way of looking at Virgil when I came up. In some places, when I first read him in high school, though, we read him as an authoritarian text. So I can see it both ways. I find that modern scholars of Virgil hold both in their head, and I know that you can't escape your own cultural context. You're stuck there no matter what, but I do think this is a pretty legitimate way of working at it, or looking at it rather. Texts don't just mean one thing. Art doesn't mean one thing. Art interacts with an audience. Art speaks to multiple parts of multiple people. And author's intent is both unknowable and not the ultimate factor in what art is saying. That is, when you're writing or creating, you may not necessarily be aware of every meaning that can be read into what you're making. Those of you who write for audiences or make art that you then show to your peers are aware of this, yeah? You make a thing, you love it for the reasons you love it, but when someone else looks at it, they'll see things that you didn't intend, you didn't try to do, but that doesn't mean they're not there. You can see them too. And then when you see them, this sparks off further inspiration. Virgil almost certainly workshopped this with his friends, and I think he's trying to speak to many people in his social circle and in his generation. And by its very definition, a generation shaped by civil war is a generation of many contradictory political and ethical beliefs. Hell, any group of people is a contradictory group of political and ethical beliefs. That informs what Virgil's doing, and I think we should keep it in mind when we try to figure out what Virgil is saying to us, and also what Virgil says to other people. You don't have to be threatened by being able to see someone else's point of view in a work of art. It can be really cool, because that's one of the first steps to understanding how somebody else's mind works. It's a beautiful process. It's nifty. So as you read the bits of Virgil I've given you, as you think about what you're going to take from it, what it means to you, keep in mind that there are all kinds of ways you can go with this. There isn't just one way, and your way is never going to look like anybody else's way. And that's a good thing, right? That's the sign of proper engagement. Final thoughts. I take you again to this somewhat tongue-in-cheek neo-fascist Augustus poster. Um, most of the references you can get now, there's the Fosques, there's a laurel wreath of victory, there's the star of Julius Caesar hanging in the sky there, Primaporta Augustus and all of his glory standing up there under the sigil of the res publica, and then underneath him it says Vox Populi, the voice of the people. Augustus has made himself self-nominated the voice of the people, and if the voice of the people wants to say anything else, well. But there's one piece left in this slide towards autocracy that we haven't gotten to yet. Also in this bit of art, the Colosseum. It's going to be a minute before we get to the Colosseum and why I'm identifying it with the full flowering of Rome as an autocratic state. So keep an eye out for that. Before we go there, though, we need to unpack a little bit why autocracy is such a bad idea. don't want you to automatically assume autocracy bad, democracy good. I think that's an unhelpful way of looking at anything. Bad and good is not a really useful dichotomy, although it's a useful moral compass in some ways. We've talked a little bit about why autocracy was attractive, why Augustus was acceptable. Tiberius, much like him, ran an organized ship. Now, for the upper class, it wasn't so fun. A lot of them ended up on trial for treason and dead under sketchy circumstances. There are a lot of conspiracy theories about the naughty, dirty things Tiberius did in his spare time. I'm not going to really get into that. Tiberius, say what you will about him, though, he ran an organized empire. Things worked. Things ran. He managed to keep the empire out of internal conflict, and he didn't make himself popular with the Senate, but they managed to rub along fairly well. Well enough that when he died, they were happy enough to treat his heir as the next emperor. His heir began his life in a Roman military camp where his father Germanicus was in charge. He was little Gaius. They called him Caligula because he had tiny Roman army boots, caligae, that went with his tiny baby army uniform. And he was the unit mascot. When he became the emperor, the legions who remembered him as a cute little boy kept using his childhood nickname, much to his displeasure. He wanted to be called Gaius, thank you very much. Being called Emperor Caligula is a little bit like being called Emperor Schnookums. Not very dignified. So his enemies, of course, latched onto this, and they're like, Emperor Schnookums. And he reacted very poorly to this. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To unpack Gaius, I've given you The Life of Gaius to read, and I'm also going to give you a link to Mary Beard's documentary to give you a break from listening to me talk at you and a slide. But also it's just good and interesting, and it helps to unpack a little bit of what's going on with Caligula beyond the entertaining out-of-control emperor behavior. The thing I want you to keep in mind is that Gaius is instructive when we think about what it is about the emperor that doesn't work so well, and why it is that we should hesitate a little bit before we choose autocracy. So I'm going to put up that link to the documentary. I'm going to try to keep that lecture short-ish. There'll be a reading for that. And then we're going to take a break and talk about plumbing for a while. Be well, take care, stay classy, and I'll see you guys later. Hang tight.